besides the Treaty of Paris, which again was quite generous towards the Americans, the government under the Articles of Confederation did accomplish a couple of things. A couple of key laws got passed. The Land Ordinance of 1785 would provide for an orderly system of selling off and settling lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. The law outlined a plan of land surveys and sales in what was then called the Northwest Territory, which is the present-day states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin, plus a little bit of Minnesota. Land there would be divided into 6 mile square townships, that's 36 square miles each, laid out in grids. Each township was then divided into sections of 640 acres each, which was 1 square mile. And each section was further divided into farms, either a half a section or a quarter section being the most common division, although you could purchase as little as a quarter section. 4 of the lots within the township were designated for use for government purposes, including public education, and 4 additional lots would be held back from sale until the area was more developed, which presumably meant that it would bring a higher price when that land was sold. Another major accomplishment of this government under the Articles of Confederation was the passing of the Northwest Ordinance in 1787. Essentially what it was a plan for developing the Northwest Territories populated by the Land Ordinance into states, turning them into this basically being an out-of-state plan. Although its basic provisions were meant to apply to the Northwest Territories, really it continued beyond the bounds of that and technically is even still in effect today with relatively minor modifications. Now, before the population of a territory reached 5,000, there would be a very limited form of government, with a governor, a secretary, and 3 judges, all appointed by Congress. When the population of free inhabitants, 5,000 men of age, adult males, once that population reached 5,000 of these free adult males, a legislature could be elected by the people of the territory, and it's considered at this point to be an organized territory. Once the total population of free inhabitants reached 60,000, and again this was men and women for that calculation, then the territory could create a state constitution. They would write it themselves and then apply to Congress for statehood. Ohio would actually be the first territory to be granted statehood within the Northwest Territory using this method. Now, the language of the Northwest Ordinance specifically prohibited slavery anywhere within the territory and would require that any escaped slave be available to be reclaimed by their owners. In addition, there was a provision promising Native Americans that their lands would never be taken from them without their consent, which of course was something that would be repeatedly broken by the United States government. It isn't just politics and structures of government that's going to change after the Revolution, but there will be some fundamental changes in society as well. In addition to the obvious independence and the changed relationship with Great Britain, you can see this change in American society with some of the laws that were passed by the Confederation Congress and in the writing of the U.S. Constitution that is to come. Aristocratic titles, which had been unofficially present in colonial times, were outright banned. Any individuals who had a title were allowed to remain in the U.S., but could receive no benefits from that title. American citizens could not be bestowed with a title at all, except if it was honorary. Laws of primogeniture that required land to be passed only to the eldest son were outright abolished. Although it was still traditional to bequeath the home farm to the eldest son, but it wasn't actually required. All children could inherit either equally or however a will specified. And if a person died intestate, meaning without a will, typically the courts would divide the estate equally amongst the children, regardless of whether they were male or female. Tax-supported churches were phased out, with the U.S. adopting the idea that no one faith was better than another. So religion was technically kept out of the public sphere, at least in terms of granting favorites. Now, a few states hung on to this practice longer than others, some as late as the 1830s, mostly in New England. But with an interest in expanding democracy and voter participation in the 1820s and 1830s, tax-supported churches would end there as well. Women were technically left out of government participation, both under the Articles of Confederation and under the Constitution, though they were encouraged to raise their children, especially their sons, to be good citizens of the Republic, which technically means then that women were given an honored place in society. But it tended to center on the home and the family, with men dominating business and politics. Also, the issue of slavery would bring about a tremendous amount of discussion and division. In keeping with the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, many of the northern states began abolishing slavery as they wrote their constitutions or shortly thereafterwards. This is going to set up a major debate between the North and the South, which kept slavery as a vital economic situation. Their farms, the plantations, the cash crops depended on it. And ultimately, this is going to result in a civil war some 8 decades later. Now we look at the way the United States existed under the Articles of Confederation. With the inability to enforce the terms of the Treaty of Paris, nations like Britain and even Spain sought to take advantage of the United States' weaknesses. Although they had evacuated their troops from New York by late 1781, Britain had not fully evacuated its forts on the extreme western frontier, including those in the Ohio River Valley, and they also kept trading posts on U.S. soil, which was technically a violation of the Treaty of Paris. But remember, the Americans were violating the Treaty of Paris as well, because they were supposed to pay for Loyalist property that had been confiscated either during or after the war. But with no money coming in, there was no way that the Confederation Congress could actually do that. They had no way of paying their debts. There would also be disputes, such as those with Spain, over what the boundaries with the nation actually were, eventually resulting in the Spanish governor of New Orleans closing the lower Mississippi River to American shipping, which would have the effect of cutting off Kentucky and Tennessee from all trade, since they relied heavily on the Mississippi River to get their goods to a world market, since going over the Appalachian Mountains was simply not profitable. There was also the fear that the Spanish and even the English were arming Native Americans to resist frontier settlement, especially settlement west of the Appalachians. And in many cases, the land there had been promised to individuals who'd served in the Revolution as a bounty for their military service, and now it was becoming virtually impossible for them to claim it. There were also domestic problems because of the Articles of Confederation, and the main issue was related to economics. Congress had been denied the power to tax citizens and could simply just request money from the states. But Congress's requests were often ignored or underfunded, so the legislature never had enough money to actually run the government or fulfill the financial obligations to bondholders, to soldiers, and to just about anyone else they owed money to. In addition, Congress and the states shared the right to regulate currency and issue money, which would lead to an excess of currency that had virtually no value, because the more currency you had, and there wasn't a lot of specie or gold or silver vaults anywhere in the United States, it just simply was unavailable. And typically that would provide a backing for paper currency. So the value of currency, paper currency, is going to decline, which is going to create inflationary pressure on the continental dollar. The central government also could not control interstate commerce, resulting in interstate tariffs and taxes, as well as disputes over navigation rights on rivers that separated the states from one another. States could and did negotiate trade relationships with other countries, often that would hurt neighboring states. And so these issues collectively helped lead to an economic depression. The Confederation's inability to stabilize and revitalize the depressed economy caused many to become discontented with the Confederation government. In addition, you still had the war-related debt that was continuing to cause problems. Even more people fell into debt through foolhardy speculation, which was encouraged by the easy availability of credit. But the lack of specie in circulation made this speculation inherently unstable, since few people could actually obtain reliable money to pay back loans that was taken to finance these speculative ventures, often speculation in land. So unchecked by national authorities, this speculation became so widespread that it would have been difficult for even a strong government to control the damaging impact on the economy. Then in 1786, Shays' Rebellion occurred in western Massachusetts as a protest to rising debt and economic chaos. Revolutionary War veteran Daniel Shays led about 4,000 rebels in an uprising against what they perceived to be economic and civil rights injustices. Merchants, who dominated the economy along the coast, as well as dominating the legislature, demanded payment for goods in specie. And again, specie is gold or silver. And they refused to accept paper currency, and they refused to extend credit, especially to farmers in the interior portions of the states. Of course, this was largely because these eastern businessmen were not being extended credit by European suppliers because we weren't paying our debts to those European countries. Anyway, the rural farming population generally were unable to meet these demands because typically they only had an income once a year and relied on the extension of credit to allow them to get the supplies they needed throughout the year until harvest time. In addition, civil authorities, those that are requiring the payment of taxes, often demanded the payment of tax in specie. And so these demands being made of them by merchants as well as these civil authorities meant that individuals couldn't pay those demands, and that often resulted in these farmers losing their land to foreclosure, losing their other possessions, because you could go to court and obtain a judgment against someone who wasn't paying their debt to you. And this included the government if you weren't paying your taxes. They could get a judgment against you, which means your property could be seized and sold to fulfill that debt. And this was a common tactic by tax collectors and businessmen. They would work with the courts, and these seizures were becoming quite commonplace, especially in the western portions of states like Massachusetts. Now, many of these farmers were still owed money by the Confederation Congress as payment for their military service, which of course the Confederation Congress still couldn't pay either because they had no income. So these rebels, these former militiamen in many cases, marched on courthouses to prevent them from issuing any further judgments or confiscating property. However, not only was Massachusetts not able to gather a military force, but the national government was not able to gather a military force among the states to help it put down this rebellion. Instead, Massachusetts merchants privately raised an army to attempt to put down the rebellion, which ultimately did scatter when faced with armed opposition, although pockets of resistance did remain for some time. But this does make it clear that there are some serious weaknesses in the structure of the Articles of Confederation. Now, before the chaos of Shays' Rebellion even got started, the economic issues were beginning to be felt, especially among society's elites. Recognizing that there was a problem with interstate commerce, George Washington hosted a meeting at his estate at Mount Vernon in 1785 to discuss some of the trade issues that were growing between the states of Maryland and Virginia, especially those dealing with the Potomac River, which is the river that separates the two, along which Washington's estate actually sits. Now, Pennsylvania and Delaware were also invited to be part of the discussions and ultimate agreements, but again, most of the focus was on the Potomac River. But the importance of this meeting is that it was a model of interstate cooperation outside of the Confederation Congress. Since other issues were plaguing the young nation and Congress seemed powerless to act, it was suggested at the end of this Mount Vernon conference to host yet another conference the following year, inviting all of the states to participate, with that next conference scheduled for Annapolis. Although all states were invited, only 5 actually had delegates present. And what's interesting is Maryland was not among them, and it was being held in the capital of Maryland. But those who were there gathered to discuss and develop a consensus about reversing some of the protectionist trade barriers that each state had erected in competition with one another. Ultimately, the convention at Annapolis decided that a broader constitutional convention was going to be needed. There simply had to be some changes to the Articles of Confederation if this Confederation Congress was going to work. And it's also as this Annapolis Convention is winding down that news of Shays' Rebellion started to be reported, and that's going to make it much more likely that more states were going to participate the next time. And they did.